Good afternoon. My name is James Patrick Sexton, and I am a PhD researcher in international law here at the Asser Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, which is entitled The Red Sea Crisis, Assessing the International Legal and Maritime Security Implications. Today's webinar is part of the HILAC Lecture series, which stands for the Hague Initiative for Law and Armed Conflict. The HILAC series has been organized since 2005 by the Asser Institute in cooperation with the Netherlands Red Cross and the Amsterdam Center for International Law. This event also takes place within the context of the International Humanitarian and Criminal Law Platform, a network of Netherlands and Belgium-based academics in the fields of international humanitarian and criminal law. The IHCL platform was established in 2010 and is coordinated by the Asser Institute. So today's HILAC lecture addresses the ongoing situation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and will specifically focus on the international law and maritime security implications. After I provide a brief overview of these recent developments, our expert speakers, who I will introduce shortly, will give their views on these pressing topics. Afterwards, for the final 25 minutes or so, we will move to an open Q&A. So please add your questions to the chat box throughout the event. My colleague Phoebe Mullis will monitor this throughout. I should mention that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel following the lecture. I will now briefly introduce our wonderful panel of expert panelists. So firstly, we have Rob McLaughlin, Professor of Law at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong. He is a visiting fellow of the Stockton Centre for International Law at the US Naval War College and honorary professor at the Australian National University. Prior to becoming an academic, he served in the Royal Australian Navy for several decades. Also joining us today is Dr. Sofia Galani, who is an assistant professor in public international law at Pantheon University in Athens, Greece. Her research expertise lies in the area of the law of the sea, maritime security, and human rights, and she has published widely in these areas. Joining us from Pretoria in South Africa, we also have Mr. Tim Walker, who is a maritime project leader and senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. Since 2011, he has worked to promote maritime security as a policy priority with organizations such as the African Union, and he is currently leading a project to strengthen African maritime security institutions. Last but not least, we have Captain Dr. Martin Fink. Martin is an associate professor of military law at the Netherlands Defense Academy, an external senior researcher in the role of armed conflict program at the Amsterdam Center for International Law, as well as a military legal advisor in the Royal Netherlands Navy. And I know that Martin has some other obligations at the moment, and that explains why he's not on the camera at this moment. I would also like to introduce my colleague, Phoebe Mullis, who is on the screen. So Phoebe is a junior researcher at the Asser Institute who works on a number of projects in the context of the Global Counterterrorism Forum. So now, before we begin our discussions, I will provide a brief factual overview of the recent developments in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So the so-called Red Sea crisis has emerged as a complex and challenging situation. The main actor involved, the Houthis, who are officially known as Ansar Allah, are an armed group supported by Iran that controls large parts of Western Yemen, including the capital. Following the 7th of October attacks carried out by Hamas in Israel, and Israel's subsequent military response in the Gaza Strip, the Houthis began firing drones and missiles directly against Israel. Then, beginning with the hijacking of the Bermuda-flagged vessel, the Galaxy Leader, in November 2023, the Houthis began targeting international commercial and merchant shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The Houthis claim that these attacks only target vessels connected to Israel. However, many ships with no ties to Israel have also come under attack. The Red Sea is a vital maritime artery linking the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea via the Suez Canal, and it facilitates nearly 15% of global trade annually. Following the recent Houthi attacks, however, many international shipping companies have redirected their ships away from the Red Sea, opting for longer and more expensive passages around the Cape of Good Hope. This is a particular challenge for the peoples of Yemen and Sudan, as the contribution of delayed aid and escalating costs further complicates the already dire humanitarian situation caused by the several armed conflicts ongoing in the region. So in response to the Houthi attacks, the international community has taken various measures. In December 2023, the United States established Operation Prosperity Guardian, a maritime protection force involving several states. On the 10th of January, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2722, demanding an immediate end to the Houthi attacks. A day later, the US and the UK began launching strikes on Houthi military targets within Yemen. Shortly afterwards, the US government redesignated the Houthis as a terrorist group, enabling stricter economic sanctions. On the 19th of February, a year-long EU naval mission, Operation Aspides, was launched to provide situational awareness and accompany vessels crossing the Red Sea. On the 2nd of March, the cargo ship Ruby Mar sank 2 weeks after it was struck by a Houthi missile. A 29-kilometer-long oil slick emerged shortly after the attack, which, in addition to the 41,000 tons of fertilizer on board, is feared to cause an environmental disaster. On the 6th of March, 3 crew members aboard the Barbados flagship, the True Confidence, were killed in a Houthi attack near the port of Aden. And this incident marked the first seafarers that were killed since the beginning of the Houthi attacks. Over the last 2 weeks, Houthi attacks have continued, with drones and missiles being intercepted by various navies. The US and the UK have also targeted more Houthi sites within Yemen. And just 2 days ago, the UN Security Council reiterated its condemnation of the Houthi attacks and demanded that they cease immediately. So with this brief summary, I'd like to dive right in with our panel of experts here. So maybe, Tim, beginning with you, in your opinion, what are the kind of direct consequences, the most direct consequences for regional and international maritime security stemming from these events?
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. Just wanted to say what a great honor it is to be amongst such esteemed experts and to be asked to speak first. Some of the increased risks that we've noted are concerning the potential militarization of responses against a backdrop of quite severe geopolitical competition at the moment, and indeed the security measures which are seen to be necessary to be implemented on board either vessels or how they are discussed at various forums. On the one hand, we see very good international cooperation in the form of the Combined Maritime Forces. Recent news that Poland has become the 42nd member of a very interesting multilateral platform. Yet at the same time, this does not have very many neighboring countries in the region. And I think that does point to one of the big risks and threats even of the fear of escalation, which comes into how we respond. Many regional countries, I think, have domestic concerns about how their reaction to Houthi attacks will be perceived. One of the other big major incidents or patterns that I think many of you will be aware of is the diversion of shipping from the route around the Cape of Good Hope, relatively near to where I'm sitting now. And that, as you said in your introduction, James, is including the diversion or the delay of some very necessary cargo, such as aid, which can affect food security. Many people might recall that over the last few years, with the disruptions in the Black Sea caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that the Black Sea corridor for grain shipments to Africa was seen as a very much at risk. And what we're seeing is that actually playing out now in another part of the world. The final thing I'll mention in this regard is around the Cape route. I think there are some concerns we need to be aware of and voicing around the navigation challenges which ensue with having greater numbers of vessels coming around this route. In particular, the need to respond in the case of oil spills and potential accidents. There is a need for greater responsive capabilities in that regard. And what we're seeing at the moment, very unfortunate, well, as a response in many regards, is ships turning off their AIS signals to provide them with some sense of security, but also to maybe sometimes mask their location. And as many of you know, that the AIS was created to provide that safety network for safe navigation. So those are some of, I think, the most direct consequences that we can observe so far. And there are a few more indirect ones, which I'm sure we will discuss as the event proceeds. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And you mentioned the previous example of the Black Sea impacting grain shipments. And I wonder, Rob, from your perspective, are there any other kind of precedents that we can look to when trying to respond to this situation, or is this quite a unique situation?
Thanks, James, and to echo Tim, it's a great honour to be on this panel with these wonderful people, and it's a fascinating topic. I think, James, in answer to your question is no, there are many precedents, and I guess I'd make 2 points. First, interfering with merchant shipping to achieve a political end is a very old, well-used strategy, both by states and non-state actors. And the objective of interfering with merchant shipping is to harm the adversary, target state, whatever it might be, through increasing the costs, economic and also in terms of insecurity, but generally by doing so in a way that avoids entanglement with naval forces, so that keeps your own costs down. Now, this is a very effective tactic and strategy against merchant vessels. They are very attractive targets in an asymmetric context because they are generally softer targets than naval vessels. They often travel alone rather than in company. They have civilians on board, passengers, merchant mariners, which adds leverage. Interference puts pressure on private actors as well as states. And obviously single incidents, like we've seen and you talked about in the introduction, can gain significant profile for whatever the objective claimed. Now, this strategy is very old by non-state actors. Indeed, you think back to the old practice of privateering, which is where a merchant vessel was given a letter of marque from a sovereign authority, which allowed it to attack other merchant shipping. This was once a prominent feature of maritime operations, and perhaps much to Martin's dismay, I'll mention good old Jacob van Heemskerk and the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, and the Santa Catarina in 1603. This was the impetus for Hugo Grotius writing Mare Liberum, freedom of the seas. So really, a non-state actor attack on a merchant vessel was in fact, one of the key factors that crystallised the whole doctrine on the freedom of the seas. More recent examples, you've got the LTTEC Tigers during the Sri Lanka Civil War. They used these tactics to inflict harm on the Sri Lankan economy and also the Sri Lankan Navy. To some extent, Somali piracy, or some claims about Somali piracy in the Indian Ocean in the 2000s. There's a group called Abu Sayyaf, and there's a few other militant groups in the Sulu Sea region in my own part of the world who take hostages to create insecurity at sea. Depending on how you think of Sea Shepherd and Neptune's navy, their interference with Japanese whaling fleets. So this is an old and tried and true tactic. But the second point I'd just quickly make is the Red Sea situation seems a bit different to this run-of-the-mill for a couple of reasons, I think. First, it started off at a very high level of kinetic effect. Seizures, missile and drone attacks. So it's quickly escalated into something that's a bit more akin to the tanker war from the 1980s than recent, say, IRGCN, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy actions in the Straits of Hormuz, which are a lower level of interference. So that means that Houthi actions in the Red Sea have really sparked a quite rapid naval response and have escalated to onshore operations as opposed to being localised at sea. The second thing is, despite the stated aim of attacking ships connected to Israel in some way or states supporting Israel, the attacks don't seem to have been actually very disciplined in that respect at all in terms of that objective. And just think for a minute about the alleged or the proposed or the thought of Houthis cutting cables in the Red Sea. That's not targeted. That's targeted at everyone, not at anyone in particular. And the third thing that I find very interesting and quite different is that the Houthis have gone after warships from the outset. That's not a usual course of action for an NSA. It's not unknown, but it's not quite usual when they want to avoid retaliation or more significant retaliation. So I think whilst it's in the mould of the traditional approach, you might say, to interference with merchant shipping by a non-state actor, it does have some nuances.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Rob and Tim, for kind of providing this initial context from the maritime security point of view. And I think, Rob, you kind of mentioned several potential legal categorizations that come into play here. And I think that this is maybe a nice segue into our next discussion. Indeed, there are many international legal frameworks that may be applicable to this situation. And I was wondering, Sophia, judging from your expertise, I was wondering if, in your opinion, any of these actions by the Houthis can be characterized as piracy, or potentially other offenses, such as under the 1988 Convention. So yeah, I wonder if we could hear your views on this.
Thank you, James, and thank you very much for the invitation as well. Well, in terms of piracy, it is perhaps the most obvious classification that one could consider. We have violent attacks against vessels, so probably we're talking about piracy. But in order to talk about piracy, we have to make sure that the criteria set by UNCLOS in Article 101 are met. The provision is very important because it defines piracy, but it also reflects customary international law. So we have to make sure that the Houthi attacks fit within the definition of this provision. And also we should not forget that whatever is classified as piracy means that it's subject to universal jurisdiction. So it's not easy always to capture everything within that definition. Now, if we look at the definition of piracy, we see that actually the provision talks about acts of violence that are committed by the crew of a vessel against another vessel in international waters for private ends. So if we take the criteria one by one, we will see, for example, that even if there is a minimum threshold for violence, I'm sure that it can certainly be met. I mean, we're talking about very violent attacks. Rob has already mentioned that, missiles are being used, seafarers have already been killed, so we definitely have violent acts. They do take place beyond territorial waters, so the geographic criterion seems to be met as well. I think there are some issues with the two ships requirement and private ends. When Houthis use vessels that have Houthi rebels on board and attacks other vessels, that's fine. Even when they use helicopters, for example, that's fine, because this is also captured by the UNCLOS definition. I think there is a question what happens when they use drones, and they use drones quite a lot. And the problem there is that we don't have the crew of a ship attacking the crew of another ship. Now, here there has been a lot of discussion about how to treat maritime autonomous vehicles and drones and so on and so forth. Some scholars believe that UNCLOS can be interpreted in a more evolutionary way, and we could consider pirates those who direct drones from a location on land. Some others are a bit more skeptical, and they think that Article 101 requires some sort of proximity, in the sense that you need to have a vessel, you need to have the crew that attacks another vessel. And I tend to be in favor of this more skeptical approach for the reason that, as I said, if you expand the definition of piracy, then there will be a lot of people that will be subject to universal jurisdiction. So if someone sits in Yemen and directs a drone, he's a pirate, and that means that he can be arrested and be tried anywhere. The other issue has to do with the private ends requirements. I think the way it started has nothing to do with private ends. I think initially the aim of the attacks was to support Palestine, to go against Israel, to put some pressure on states that support Israel. But as Rob has already explained, they haven't been really consistent. I mean, they have attacked vessels that have nothing to do with Israel. They attack, for example, a vessel that flies the flag of Panama, that's of Greek interests, and the seafarers on board have nothing to do with Israel. So in this case, I think that the private ends requirement should be met, because they do that for another purpose, probably, to take ransoms for another financial benefit that could probably meet the private end's requirements. Now, it doesn't mean, however, that, whatever cannot be treated as piracy, that, that we have a legal gap. I think the Suez Convention can also be helpful here. The Suez Convention has a very long list of offenses that can be, criminalized by the Suez Convention. It doesn't have these crew or ship against ship requirements that we see within UNCLOS. It doesn't have a geographical limitation. So a lot of more of these illegal activities could fit within the Suez Convention without having to worry how they are committed or who conducts them and from which location. But as I said, we have to bear in mind that, universal jurisdiction is there, and judging from the experience that we had with states, I'm not sure that states really want to exercise universal jurisdiction over Houthis. I'm not sure they want to bring them back to Europe or to the US to try them, because of course then we will have all the human rights issues that we'll have to consider, because they're entitled to human rights, and states will have to bear this in mind as well. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Sophia. And that was the next question I was going to ask you, just about the relevance of international human rights law, in this situation, and yeah, the relevance to it. I don't know if you would like to expand, or maybe we could return to that later on.
Well, in terms of the human rights of those who are suspected of these illegal activities, I mean, we all know that as soon as they are arrested, then they come within the jurisdiction of states, and states will have to protect their human rights. They also have human rights, when states use force in the region during these operations, they also have to consider their human rights. Unless we're talking about, a conflict, something that Rob and Martin, I think, will discuss, so things might be slightly different there. But we all know that, these people, just as it happened with pirates, they have human rights. And as long as they are captured by states, states will have to respect and protect their human rights.
Perfect. Thank you, Sophia. And indeed, maybe moving on to the question of the use of force, Martin, I wonder how, in your view, can the Houthis' actions be characterized under the international law governing the use of force?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, James, for having me on the panel and giving me some time to talk a little bit about this subject. Secondly, I would like to apologize here. Unlike the rest of the world, I am still not able to put this blurry stuff in the background or some nice picture in the background. So I welcome you all into my hotel room this morning. And just to react to Rob here, of course, the action against the Santa Catarina was totally lawful. I just will underline that again after 400 years. So, having said that, so let's talk a little bit about the jus ad bellum in this very particular issue. I think there are many different subjects that we can discuss in this context, but I will focus my discussion on 3 points dealing with self-defense. So the first point that we'll touch upon is the different modalities of self-defense, I think, which are used in this discussion. Second is the question of the author of the attack in the context of self-defense. And thirdly, of course, there is the question of what is the attack directed against and whether that could trigger the right of self-defense. So those 3 points I will just briefly have some remarks on. With regard to the modalities of self-defense, I think, first of all, we should acknowledge, and you also already said, James, that there are 4 different operations in the area: Poseidon, Archer, Prosperity, Guardian, and the EU operations Aspides and Atalanta. But what we need to underline, in my opinion, is that they all have different mandates with also different main tasks. So Atalanta, in its very strict mandate, is basically a law enforcement operation against the crime of piracy. If we then look at the Poseidon Archer, the states contributing to Poseidon Archer, this is basically a military strike operation against Houthi targets on land in response to what those states say against military units who are part of this operation, and also in also against merchant shipping in general. Now, the mandates of Prosperity Guardian and Aspides are again different, because there it's basically limited to accompanying merchant vessels through the area of operations and to protect and defend those vessels against attack. And then if you then read the EU decision on it, it says in compliance with international law, which is quite a general statement, of course. But anyhow, so these mandates are basically more limited than Poseidon Archer. Now, in my opinion, whereas the overall purpose of all the missions is basically to ensure freedom of navigation and the protection of merchant shipping, it's not the legal basis for the use of force. With regard to the use of force, I think it's interesting. That's where I come to the modalities, is that all these operations seem to be based on different types or different forms of self-defense. So if we now go back to Poseidon Archer, the states that are part of Poseidon Archer, they have specifically invoked national or state-level self-defense based on Article 51. Which is also specifically underlined in their letters to the UN Security Council. Atalanta, and the use of force in Atalanta to prosecute piracy is derived from law enforcement standards. So here another form of self-defense is used in a law enforcement context, where most probably personal self-defense is the legal ground to use force in arresting persons and vessels. When we look at Prosperity Guardian SPS, well, these operations, it seems that these operations use a form of self-defense that may perhaps be called on-the-spot or localized self-defense against attacks of merchant vessels and also military units. And the purpose of this self-defense is basically taking away the immediate threat to merchant vessels and their own units. I think, however, that discussion exists with regard to the question of what the actual legal ground is for on-the-spot or localized self-defense. First of all, I think it's interesting to note also that the UN Security Council resolution has actually recognized, in my opinion, that such rights exist, because it says that there is a right to defend vessels from attacks, including those to undermine navigational rights and freedom. So there seems to be some sort of an acceptation of this right. But what the legal ground is, what the exact legal ground is, there seems to be somewhat of a discussion. And I think here we need to distinguish between attacks against merchant vessels and attacks against military units. Arguably, I would say that self-defense against military units might be derived from a localized version of self-defense, or national self-defense, which allows to take actions against immediate threats by commanders of military units, also known as unit self-defense. And which or may not, but however, as a separate issue, could also trigger national level responses. But those are two different things. Less easy is to derive on-the-spot self-defense from merchant vessels from national self-defense because of its remoteness of a merchant vessel to the state. Other than that, it's flying its flag, and usually also even the crew is not even the same nationality of the flag, so there's quite some remoteness here. So arguably here, what self-defense is left here is to base on-the-spot self-defense on is basically personal self-defense against imminent threats or imminent attacks against people or goods. In this case, ships, which also can be protected without any nationality links. Well, at least that depends on your domestic law, but usually it's without nationality links. So in a way, I think that personal self-defense could be also the legal ground to defend merchant shippings against immediate threats. And perhaps it could also be argued as that it is the same ground as we use for the use of force grounds that vessel protection detachments have, only on a different and larger scale in this event. So summarizing this first point, first of all, so all the operations have different modalities of self-defense, and secondly, on-the-spot self-defense of merchant vessels does exist, because it's also in the UN Security Council. Only the legal ground for that is a bit of a discussion. Moving to the second point on the author author of the attack, I'm going to be very brief with regard to the author of the attack, the Houthis. Well, if we accept that self-defense as a legal basis in this scenario, well, let me put it a different way. If we accept that non-state actors can in fact be authors of self-defense, yeah, then in this scenario, of course, there's ground, or there's an open door to use this ground. And obviously here we find different views ranging from, well, no, unless the non-state actor is under effective control of another state. And on the other end of the spectrum, we can say yes, but under the requirements that the state has to be unable and unwilling to do something about it. And also the armed attack has to be crossing a border. And here we come, of course, in the discussion whether or not the Houthis can perhaps be seen as maybe the de facto government of at least parts of Yemen, or perhaps we could argue that the Houthis are supported by Iran, and that Iran is basically in effective control over these actions. And clearly, there's a lot of speculation on that front. Not just with supplying arms, but perhaps even with more direct support, for instance, by coordinating goals and activities, such as providing operational targeting information. So if you read the news clippings online, you'll see different discussions on that. Touching lastly on the third point that I would like to share with you is, of course, the discussion on what the attack is in fact directed against, and whether that can actually trigger the right of self-defense. Also here, as I said before, I think we should distinguish between military units and merchant vessels. And for military units, in my mind, there's a general agreement that attacking them might trigger a state's right of self-defense because of their character and the fact that they are state representatives, which is also underlined, for instance, in the oil platform case. But less clear is whether the right of self-defense is triggered where an armed attack occurs against merchant vessels. Here we find diverging views. On the one hand of the spectrum, we find views that merchant vessels are neither a direct representative of the state or also not seen as territory, and therefore does not trigger the right of self-defense. And on the other end of the spectrum, we find views that it's not completely ruled out. For instance, where there is a clear intention that the attack against merchant vessels is in fact to impose some sort of coercion against the flag state itself. So in a way, we're talking about a type of indirect targeting the state through attacking its merchant vessels. And I think that does make some sense if you are deliberately attacking merchant vessels with a clear intention to coerce that flag state. In that sense, that there might be arguments to say that it's that attack against those merchant vessels could also be an attack against that flag state. And of course, here then there's of course a threshold question. Whether the scale is big enough. So to finish this, in this respect, I mean the Red Sea case gives us basically 2 points on that on this scenario. And then the first, and it was already touched upon a couple of times, is that the Houthis seem to be against Israel, but in actual deeds they don't. In actual deeds, they are targeting all kinds of vessels, and they are not just limiting them to things that have enemy character, to use a law of naval warfare term. But if that would be the case, it arguably would only give Israel the right of self-defense and not another state. And the second point that we can get from this, from what we have at the moment, is that well, in Operation Poseidon Archer, the US and the UK do not argue, or do not directly argue, that self-defense is the basis for their attack. Self-defense against merchant vessels is the basis for their attack, but they very cautiously argue that attack against their military units is triggering the right of self-defense. So basically, they're steering away from the whole issue and accepting a more accepted ground, namely self-defense against warships and their own military units. So that's their primary argument why self-defense in this case works for them. So this leads me to believe that there is no firm grounds at this stage to accept self-defense against attacking warships, especially when they are from another state. We'll leave it at that at this stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for the very comprehensive answer to this question. And I think maybe this then leads us to the question of the applicability of international humanitarian law, also known as the law of armed conflict. So I was wondering, Rob, if maybe you could walk us through whether, in your view, there is an armed conflict ongoing or multiple armed conflicts. Yeah, perhaps we can start with this question.
Oh, certainly, and it's a key point to make, as Martin did, that when we're talking about the law of armed conflict, the jus in bello, it's a different set of rules to the jus ad bellum, and we have to talk about them separately. So, is there an armed conflict? Yes, there are multiple armed conflicts afoot in this region. There's a non-international armed conflict between the Houthis as a non-state actor and the Yemeni government, and that's happening in the territory of Yemen. There's an armed conflict. The jury's out on whether it's a non-international armed conflict or an international armed conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. There's perhaps also a similar armed conflict, currently sporadic, but with real potential to flare up, between Israel and Hezbollah to the north, and also perhaps even ultimately Israel and Lebanon. But there is not, or I don't think there is yet, an armed conflict between Israel and the Houthis. And I think that's a point Martin was making as well. I mean, yes, the Houthis have targeted Israeli territory with missiles, which were intercepted en route. Yes, the Houthis have claimed that their actions are all in support of Hamas and its conflict with Israel. But this does not mean that there is a direct armed conflict between Israel and the Houthis yet. And indeed, if we're going to assess whether that threshold is ever crossed, then we have to use the non-international armed conflict threshold, which is not as easy to get across as the international armed conflict threshold, which is when it's between two states. I think the more difficult question, and Martin sort of started to lay some groundwork here as well, is whether the Houthi attacks on the US and UK warships and then the US and UK strikes on Houthi infrastructure ashore have created a non-international armed conflict between these states on one hand and the Houthi non-state actor on the other. Look, as a purely legal answer, I think you probably could say that threshold has been crossed, but NIAC is a very political determination. So that's, I think, very much a wait and see question as to how that's going to evolve.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rob. And you mentioned the involvement of third states. If it is determined, or if the consensus is that either now or in the near future the threshold is met for the intensity of hostilities between the Houthis and the US and the UK, perhaps other states, how would the involvement of Iran and its support for the Houthis, how would that impact the conflict classification in your view? Would that reach the threshold to potentially change this into an international armed conflict, or do you think that this threshold is not met?
Look, that's a really significant question. I think the involvement of a third state such as Iran could affect this determination in two sort of really significant ways. First, if the state is involved in supporting the Houthis in its operations against Israel, then depending on the scope and nature of that support, that state is giving to the Houthis, then that state itself may become party to a new international armed conflict against Israel. So that's one risk. So that would mean if that situation evolved, that Israel could be simultaneously in a non-international armed conflict with the Houthis and a parallel international armed conflict with a state that is supporting the Houthis in its operations against Israel. Not operations against ships, but against Israel. Second, if it were determined that a state is supporting Houthi attacks on warships in the Red Sea, and that this rose to the level of co-belligerency, meaning that state was effectively a co-belligerent with the Houthis against those warships, then that would indeed be a very serious situation, and that would open up the availability of international armed conflict, law of armed conflict authorizations as between the attacked warship states and the state facilitator of those Houthi attacks. But to reach this threshold, and this is something Martin noted, to reach this threshold, then the support rendered by the state to the Houthis in their attacks on the warships would have to be something more than just advice and weapons. And the reason that's quite a current issue is because think of the support that many states give to Ukraine right now. And that has not created international armed conflict between those states and Russia. So we have to apply the same metrics if we're thinking about support of another state to the Houthis in relation to actions against those warships in the Red Sea.
Thank you, Rob. And yeah, I think that's a very interesting analogy, the support for Ukraine and in the conflict against the Russian Federation. I think moving on to the topic of seafarers, we mentioned this before, and Sophia, you also touched on this. Of course, the attacks are negatively affecting seafarers. I wonder, in your view, Sophia, if you could maybe expand on the different ways that this is affecting seafarers. Of course, there's the obvious injury and death, but also perhaps some other issues. And again, perhaps what the relevance of human rights law is for the seafarers in this situation.
Thank you, James. Well, actually, as you mentioned, and Tim and Rob have already mentioned this point as well, the attacks have a tremendous impact on the well-being of seafarers. We have seafarers who were killed, seafarers who were severely injured, and we have seafarers who have been taken hostage since November and they haven't been released yet. So these attacks have a tremendous impact on their physical and mental well-being. Seafarers are prepared for a lot of hardships, but right now they're being caught in a crossfire, like if they're in a war zone. And obviously they're not prepared for it, and they should not be prepared for it. They are much more prepared than they used to be before the peak of the Somali piracy, because back then they received a lot of training, and they are much more prepared in terms of how to deal with violent attacks and how to protect themselves. Not all of them, most of them, but still, I mean, the impact is very bad, and we should not forget that the seafarers are still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, when a lot of them were left stranded at sea for months. Others were forced to stay on land without any job for months. So as they're going back to normal, this happened, which makes things very complicated for them. What worries me, and judging from my experience and research from the time that we had the Somali piracy problems, is that there is a very slow response on behalf of the international community, again, in relation to seafarers. So if one reads the Security Council resolutions about Somali piracy, what we can notice is that they made some references to seafarers. We express our concern about the fact that they're being hostage, that they're being taken hostage. Or, we urge states we urge pirates to release them. But in my view, this is not enough to protect their human rights. And right now we're seeing the same. I mean, the resolutions use exactly the same language. We express concern. We urge the Houthis to release the hostages. But obviously, this is not enough. I think more can be done. I mean, flag states, for example, they are meant to exercise jurisdiction over their vessels. They're meant to take whatever precautions they can to protect vessels, to protect the seafarers on board these vessels. This might be training. This might be other safety measures. It might be armed guards on board vessels again. As I mentioned earlier, the states that operate in the region, when they use force, they have to bear in mind that seafarers are there as well. So they have to take precautions to protect them from death, to protect them from lethal force. They need to plan operations. They need to have medical assistance in place. All these are human rights safeguards that we can find in case law that has to do with operations where force is used. So states that operate in the region have to bear this in mind. It's not just about killing Houthis or preventing attacks. They have to bear in mind that seafarers are caught in crossfire. And obviously, because the shipping industry is a very complex industry, we don't only have states. We have shipping companies as well. We have ship owners. They can do more. They responded very slowly to piracy. They're much better now. I've spoken to a number of people in Greece because they have great interests and they're very keen to protect seafarers this time. But again, they have to make sure that, you know, whatever can be given to them in terms of training and precautions, everything needs to be done. And obviously, we should not forget that, you know, for the time that they're hostage, they need to be paid. They have families, they need to receive compensation. They need to receive compensation once they're back. They need to receive support to recover from trauma. And these are things that states often forget, and shipping companies as well, because, you know, they're just keen to get the business going. And one more point that is relevant should be mentioned is what Rob said. This time things are much more complicated. We don't talk about pirates, we talk about criminals. I mean, the US has already designated the Houthis as a terrorist organization. So I'm afraid that there might be incidents in which we will have hostages and states that will not be willing to do anything to release them, because obviously states will not be willing to pay ransoms to a terrorist group that is associated with Iran. And then this will make things much more complicated for seafarers. And these are things that will need to be considered very carefully going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Yeah, please, Martin, feel free.
Can I just add a very small open door thing? Is I absolutely agree with Sophia and the possible responsibilities that states would have over their own seafarers and the actions they should take, all the practical actions they should take in order to protect our own seafarers. If we're talking about human rights law, of course, on the other side, well, if we're talking about accountability of human rights, we are. And then there's a big question on whether Houthi as a non-state actor can actually be accountable for human rights violations. That's a bit difficult because they're not a state. So on the other side, the persons that actually do this, it's pretty hard to make them accountable for possible human rights violations if they do actions which are outside the laws of armed conflict, as Rob has explained.
Thank you, Martin, for your addition. Yeah, and indeed, that's a continuing problem, the accountability of non-state actors. And yeah, Sophia, I think it's really good, your intervention. It indeed seems that this is not in the conversation as much, the seafarers. So yeah, thank you very much. And moving on to a somewhat related topic, Tim, we discussed earlier the sinking of the Ruby Mar by the Houthis in the Gulf of Aden, and the large oil spill, and the number of tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer on board and the potential environmental impact. Of course, this adds a new dimension to the situation, and I'm just wondering from the maritime security perspective how this complicates matters in your view.
Thank you, James. Yeah. The complications, and I think what the sinking and what we're hearing from the conversation today around the question of duty and liability of ownership in this regard is quite fascinating. The ship itself presents an obstacle to navigation through that area. There are, I think, very plausible explanations that the anchor of the Ruby Mar might have disturbed some of the subsea cables. We wouldn't be having this conference if it wasn't for subsea cables transmitting the internet around the world. So the question, I think, of ability, the duty of the owner comes in this regard. Ian Rolby in the
Oh, I think we've maybe lost connection with Tim momentarily. Hopefully he'll be able to rejoin shortly. But maybe on this topic, I wonder either Rob or Martin, if you have any views on Ian saying Tim's subsea cable just got cut. Robert or Martin, whether you have any views on how this complicates the situation, and then hopefully we can return to Tim when he rejoins. Oh,
I
Tim.
guess.
Yep, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, Tim's back. Excellent.
Tim, I think we lost you for a second, but please feel free to pick up where you.
Thank you. Sorry, colleagues. Some of you might be aware that some of the cables connecting South Africa were damaged earlier this week, and that has affected signal. So I think we might know why. I apologize. I'm not quite sure where I got lost there, but yes, the environmental impact of that tonnage of cargo into the water, it's not something we've really sort of tested before, and the modeling of that does pinpoint that it's going to have a very negative impact. The ships, as we well know from the Wakashia and Mauritius, carry a lot of fuel on board, which is not it's a very nasty substance to have released into the water as well. I think, like I say, the questions and this was raised in a previous couple of seminars was the murky world of shipping ownership in that regard, and discerning who or how is responsible, has some kind of responsibility to do something about that. Djibouti as a country, I think, was reluctant or did not want to take the Ruby Mire in before it was eventually sunk. And the same is applying to the True Confidence, which is, I think, steaming or being towed to Oman at present, again with a cargo on board and risk of breaking up. And this is obviously where the people were killed tragically during the previous attack. One thing I think I'll just add as well, when it comes to the environmental side of things too, is that with the number of ships being diverted around the Cape as well, there's a lot of questions around bunkering, around refueling of vessels, around long-term impact or long-term projections of how this how long insecurity will prevail in the region and what that will mean for shipping. Because this is coinciding now with conversations in many African countries about decarbonization and the future investments in either new shipping, new fuel, and those kind of questions which have a real climate change impact, and the balancing of short-term implications of investing in port facilities which are able to provide fuel to ships which are not necessarily going to be environmentally friendly, but might be plying trade for a few years to come, versus the long-term implications of new investments, which are obviously very complicated and very expensive at the moment. I think, and yeah, in terms of what ammonium, like say ammonium phosphate, sulfate, or whatever it is, what I mean by that is the cargo itself. When we talk or communicate this to the public, storing 21,000 tons of something which, even if it wasn't directly the cause of the explosion in Beirut a few years ago, but in the public mind will be that the salvaging of that, the transporting of it to a location, there seems to be all manner of threats related to that as well, which are not maybe well understood or communicated. And I think that's one of the questions around commercial litigation comes in as well. And this is where we probably need to explore that. The one thing I just want to also add very quickly was perhaps a conversation for us to consider is the USS Mason was attacked a few months ago, and it was actually attacked in 2016 as well, I think by the Houthi, and they responded in turn as well by trying to degrade Houthi capabilities inland as well, and the precedent around that as well, I think, is worth considering, just to show that this is actually a conflict with a long history and many other things which we need to tackle. Thanks. So I hope the internet will stay on.
Thanks, Tim. And maybe Rob, you were going to mention something before. I don't know if you still want to jump in.
I was just going to say, you asked about does what Tim's saying change from a military perspective?
Yep.
As to the applicable law, not really. I mean, depending on which rule set's applying, is it law of the sea, MARPOL and so on, or is it the law of armed conflict or the law of naval warfare? Both of these sets of rules, or both these bodies of law include environmental rules. But as to operational considerations for navies, and Martin may have something to say on this as well, absolutely yes, because search and rescue, salvage, navigation hazard, mitigation, environmental incident response, these are all functions that on the scene naval forces can and do respond to. But doing so always comes at a cost, and that's a thing. If you're responding to a maritime casualty incident, for example, you need to stay in a particular area, and you're unable to steam to another area where some other type of response, such as missile interdiction, might be required. So this is really more a resource management issue for commanders, not so much in terms of environmental response, not so much a legal challenge.
Yep, Martin, please jump in.
No, I think Rob is spot on. From a military perspective, I would say that this goes into a mandate discussion of these different international operations, and who is responsible for that, and whether it fits within the mandate. And then it connects, of course, as Rob said, is that it connects to capabilities and the question whether it's within the international operation, or whether you will keep the responsibility to react on these things to the different nations themselves. So there these things again, I underline what Rob says, is from a legal perspective, not so much from an operational perspective. Yeah, there's bound to be some discussions on how to deal with this.
Perfect, thank you. And I see a couple of questions in the chat about whether this lecture will be recorded. It is being recorded, and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you missed the start, you can watch it within a couple of weeks. With an eye on the clock, I think maybe we can ask maybe one more question. And I think related to what you just said, Martin, and Rob, about the different operations ongoing at the moment. And I was wondering, Sophia, about the EU's mission in particular, and what are the added benefits of having this EU mission in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and whether, there's benefits to have multiple overlapping missions, or if there's a risk of having, too many actors in the same place.
Thanks, James. Well, to be honest, the more the merrier, the more the better. Again, judging from the experience with Somalia, we had a lot of naval operations back then. NATO was there, the EU was there, individual states were there operating in the regions, and they were effective. The operations acted as a deterrent in combination with the measures taken by the industry, of course, by the shipping industry, but they were effective in deterring pirates from attacking vessels. There might be some concern about how they're going to communicate with each other, how they're going to cooperate. But again, they have the experience. In the context of the Somali piracy, they had shades. They can have deconfliction meetings where they exchange best practices, concerns, discuss the way forward. So the same can happen this time. Obviously, there are concerns, and I think Tim mentioned that already, about the fact that we keep deploying military assets in the region. It's a region that's already very fragile. I'm not sure that the Arab states are very keen to have all of these military assets in their backyard. And I think this is the reason why the EU has been very keen to shape their mandate in a way that has nothing to do with the conflict, with Israel, with what the US or the UK try to do in the region. And I think Tim mentioned that as well. It's a very sensitive issue. I know from, because Greece is one of the countries that took the lead along with Italy in the operation. The Greek society is deeply divided. A large part of the society feel that we should not be there because with what we do, we support Israel. So, these things complicate the situation. And I know that the EU is very keen not to get involved in any conflict. They want the region to remain stable. Europe has already been experiencing 2 wars, one in Ukraine, one in Israel, large waves of migrants and refugees. We had Syria. We definitely don't want to see another conflict that will lead to another large wave of refugees and migrants coming towards Europe. So, it's good that they're there. They're meant to be there to protect maritime traffic. But on the other hand, we have to be very cautious about how we handle the operations in order to make sure that we're not going to fuel further tension in the region.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Sophia, for that overview. And maybe quickly before we turn to the audience Q&A, which my colleague Phoebe has been monitoring, I wonder if I could ask all the panelists maybe for one brief key takeaway, as we look into the future, what is the main thing that you think should be on the agenda as we move forward? So perhaps we can start with Tim.
Well, from my side, and actually links to one of the questions related down there is looking again, and Martin and Rob and Sophia have all spoken about it as well, the what role either at the United Nations Security Council, but also at regional Security Council levels, particularly the African Union, will they either attempt to steer the conversation or also provide a platform for discussing these matters as well. This is maritime security in general. Specifically, it's very hard to always just put it into a regional bracket. Sometimes it does have global implications, and there's a global threat to peace and security. Even the implications, as we've experienced so far today, down in as far away as South Africa. There is going to be an interest there, a long-term interest. So I think that's a key takeaway for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And maybe moving on to Martin.
Yeah, thank you, James. Let me just react on Sophia before I say something on the other issue. Is when we all got together against piracy, we had one common enemy, which is piracy, which made it a lot easier for us to work together. And exactly as Sophia said, this situation has a lot of diplomatic different backgrounds, which may make it less easy for us, for different states to work together. And it ties in with the last remark I indeed had. It looks very bleak. The actions that that the states have taken so far didn't really move into the better direction. And I also do not have the answer, unfortunately, or else I would really I would give it. Just make sure that we just want to make sure that we're not making it any worse. Sorry, that's not much of an answer, but it's I can't. At this stage, it's very difficult to say something about that.
Well, I think in itself that's a good answer, a realistic answer. Rob, perhaps you could say a couple of words before Sophia.
Look, certainly. I mean, I think I share Martin's pessimism, and I think Tim's idea of internationalizing management and steadying management of the conflict is really important, because my concern is that the potential for kinetic and legal context escalation and conflict broadening in the Red Sea situation, I think, is very high. But we also need to take into account the Houthi threat to take these attacks back into the Gulf of Aden again. And as Tim said, they've done that before. I think we need to take that seriously. The Houthis have already demonstrated a willingness to escalate, both in terms of targets by attacking warships and in terms of effects, broad consequences of cable cutting, if in fact they did do that. So I'm a bit pessimistic, I have to admit, about the chances of the several naval missions that are now operating in the Red Sea. I'm just not sure they're going to be able to remain as straightforward merchant vessel defence and escort operations over the midterm future, because even though that's the outer limit of operations that some of these missions have set, including the EU mission, I unfortunately think that in the Red Sea, if the Houthis escalate, there will be other escalations, and that might complicate the situation.
Perfect. And Sophia, if you have any key takeaways.
Well, actually, I was reading the questions, and there was a question about who's going to pay the costs for all of this. And I realized, how important it is for people to understand that, it will be the shipping companies that will pay. They will have to pay for extra insurance and all of these. But at the end of the day, it's the customers that will have to pay all the extra costs that the shipping industry will have to incur again. because of these attacks against the vessels. So I think it's important for people to realize that, you know, these operations is not just about supporting Israel, or it's not just about, you know, a game of power. It is important to protect the maritime routes for the sake of everyone, for the sake of the global economy. Now, how things are going to play out, I don't know. I mean, as Rob said, things might escalate even more, but I think it's important to protect the vessels and to protect seafarers, as I said, not just for the sake of what we believe or for the sake of politics, but actually for very practical reasons, because we need ships. You know, we should not forget that 90% of the global commerce is being transported on ships, and the Red Sea is a very important maritime route. So we need to do something to protect the vessels and the seafarers on board in order to get the maritime commerce going. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's also a very nice end, a nice note to end on for our conversation. But now we can turn to the questions in the chat, and my colleague Phoebe Mullis has been monitoring. So I think Martin also has to leave now. So thank you very much, Martin, for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And yes, goodbye. See you, Martin. And yes, so my colleague Phoebe Mullis has been monitoring the chat. So I wonder, Phoebe, if you could maybe ask one of the questions to our panelists.
Yeah, thank you, James, and thank you to all of our audience members who have sent in some really great questions. So one member was wondering, in the panelists' professional opinion, do you think the rerouting of ships around the Gulf of Hope will inspire a resurgency of Somali piracy off the Somali and Kenyan coast, and whether this would maybe affect the current operations against the Houthis?
So please just feel free to jump in, whoever wants to tackle the question first.
Should I go first? Well, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I see some opportunity there for the Somali pirates. That's true. I think there have already been some attacks, more attacks than we had before. And what this shows is that they're still there. They just wait for the right opportunity. I think that we should not forget that all the problems that we have at sea are symptoms of what happens on land. You know, the situation in Somalia hasn't changed tremendously. Yemen also experiences a lot of problems. So this is why we have these attacks at sea. The criminal groups are there. They just wait for a window of opportunity. And I think that the problems now in the Red Sea is something that might allow for the resurgence of piracy, maybe not at the same scale as we experienced back in 2010, but I think there will be a rise in attacks.
If I could just add a bit to that as well, and again, hoping the pirates aren't cutting the cable when I speak, that yes, the capability, I think, of Somali communities or the capacity building which has occurred over the last 15 years, 10 years or so, it's been quite substantial. And as we know, Somalia has been very keen to frame its capabilities as sufficient in this regard. So it'll be interesting, as I say, to see how that plays out. There are partnerships with Turkey that have been recently announced, which also I think will have a tremendous impact on how that goes. And Sophia is absolutely right. It's very opportunistic. One of the key attributions for the decline in piracy was the naval patrols, and the naval patrols have moved to the Red Sea or thereabouts. What we are seeing, though, is the Houthi attacks increasingly spreading into the Gulf of Aden again, and how that will continue as well. The role of the Indian Navy as well at present has been fascinating. The arrest of I think approximately 35 pirates recently on quite a spectacular looking seizure of the Ruin vessel is worth noting as well, that there is a country who does seem very determined to prevent a resurgence or a spread of piracy in the region as well. But one country, as we know, is not able to sufficiently have the maritime security effect we want. The other thing I just want to say is that we don't know, maybe that pirates or even armed groups elsewhere around the continent might, or not just the African continent, but around the world, might utilize and see the lessons learned from the Houthi of leveraging quite cheap, relatively simple technology to have a strategic effect. One thing we see from insurgent movements throughout history is the borrowing or copying of tactics and lessons from elsewhere as well. And that's one thing I think needs to be demonstrated, that it does not have that strategic effect, but the available capability among navies or even regional communities and architecture is quite strained at the moment. So yeah, it's hard not to be a little pessimistic.
Rob, any further thoughts on the pessimism?
No, I guess I'd just add to what Sophia and Tim were saying, that, you know, the paradoxical thing is that when we were at the height of Somali piracy, one of the ways we tried to deal with this was to, you know, set up the International Maritime Transit Corridor, which just happened to be off the coast of Yemen. Obviously, that's not going to work this time, because that's going to be a risk factor if the Houthis are lobbing missiles. It's about the right range off the coast. So, you know, that pushes shipping back out into the broader Indian Ocean again, where it's much more, you know, which is much harder to patrol. Your maritime domain awareness and over that vast area is much more difficult to maintain, which does create, as Sophia said, the right conditions for piracy again, if the situation ashore would encourage that.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for your answers. Maybe Phoebe, I could ask for another question from the chat.
Yeah. So another member was wondering, and this is specifically addressed to Dr. Sophia Ghanani, but of course, if anyone else would like to answer, do you believe that the actions of the Houthis could be classified as terrorism, considering the recent reclassification of the Houthis as a terrorist organization by the United States?
Thank you. Well, that's a tough one. I mean, we have a working definition for terrorism. So if we take the working definition for terrorism, it says that, you know, acts that are meant to intimidate and terrorize civilians and states, and are meant, you know, to force states, to compel states to do or abstain from an act, then that's an act of terrorism. So, you know, on this basis, the violent attacks that are meant to intimidate, you know, seafarers or the countries in the region or the world in general, and are meant, you know, to stop states from supporting Israel, to abstain, to force them abstain from, you know, sending support to Israel, then yes, this could be considered as an act of terrorism. But as I said, it's a working definition. What we treat as terrorism is a political issue. And I wonder, you know, if we treat Houthis as terrorists and if we treat their attacks as terrorism, how much this will help us in terms of responding to their attacks. I mean, again, if we take, for example, the Hostages Convention, you know, taking people, capturing people for the purpose, again, for forcing states to do or abstain from an act, then this is, you know, an act of terrorism. So, you know, capturing pirates, capturing seafarers, sorry, you know, in order to force the US or the UK or Israel, you know, to stop the war or whatever, then yes, this could be treated as an act of terrorism. And then jurisdiction can be exercised on the basis of, you know, ad dedere ad judicare, but, you know, that's about it, that a terrorism convention tells us. And one problem that I have with this type of conventions is that they're always focused on what the state can do, how state can exercise jurisdiction. As long as the state exercises jurisdiction, then the human rights of those arrested are perfectly protected. And then what happens with the victims of terrorism is a different scenario. You know, these conventions, the terrorism conventions, doesn't tell us anything about the victims, don't tell us anything about the victims. And this is where we have a gap in terms of the protection of the victims of terrorism. And I don't like these conventions, but it is how it is.
No, the victims are very important and indeed should not be overlooked. I wonder, Tim or Rob, if you have anything to add. If not, then we can jump to the next question. Okay, perfect. Phoebe, please.
Yeah, so another member has asked, what is your take about the ongoing three-level geostrategic competition or militarization between great powers, regional powers, and intra-regional states and its impact on the maritime domain awareness of the states surrounding the Red Sea and their people.
Any volunteers?
Well, it's a great risk as a lawyer. I'll engage on a strategic one. Look, my own personal view is, and Tim will obviously have a much more refined view on this, but is that's always been the way in maritime. You know, there are great states, great powers who have significant maritime capabilities. They've always taken on a certain role in the world's oceans, and I don't think we see anything in the Red Sea situation that would sort of go counter to that general trajectory. That if there is something, I mean, Sophia said, you know, we all rely on the maritime industry. 90+% of our, you know, cargo is delivered via in hulls. So the moment that the economy is threatened, the moment that freedom of navigation is threatened, some of those larger powers are going to be interested in that area, and that is just an unavoidable aspect of the nature of maritime security and maritime domain management.
Absolutely, Rob. And in terms of the impact on maritime domain awareness of the Red Sea littoral, yes, I am concerned on one hand that a growing practice and a growing number of vessels who want to ply their trade between Russia or a country who might buy their oil is using vessels which are not going to be visible through existing maritime domain awareness mechanisms and capabilities, and that seems to be a growing practice. I'm not saying it's becoming a normal, legitimizing it per se, but the fact that more and more vessels are doing that does raise the stakes of good maritime domain awareness. And the more there is competition, and particularly I think militarization, if we look at it from the lens of where information becomes intelligence and it becomes classified, or it becomes that something states are very reluctant to share. When the commercial side of things as well, I think there's a lot of interest in the setup of reporting mechanisms which talk of or classify piracy incidents, for instance, for example. But there's a commercial element too, so there's always going to be that reluctance sometimes, and this is where perhaps organizations such as the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which has been very present in facilitating the creation of what the Djibouti Code of Conduct, for instance, where all the regional states basically within the area affected have already at their disposal these mechanisms. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to responding to a lot of these. It's a resuscitation, sometimes a revival, but the mechanisms are there as well. So provided that there is a very, I would say, proactive or key, especially from an African perspective, or the African littoral side, meeting halfway on these matters, then I think some of these dangers inherent in the question will be mitigated.
I think not reinventing the wheel is a running theme, I think, through this lecture. Sophia, I don't know if you want to add anything for that question, or whether, okay, maybe Phoebe, then we can move on to the next question.
Yeah, sure. We also have another question relating to Sudan. So how do the compounding effects of delayed aid and the escalating costs exacerbate the existing humanitarian crisis in Sudan, and what measures may be taken to alleviate these pressures?
Any takers?
Really?
No, I wish I could. Yeah, please, Sophia. I wish I could, but it's a problem and it needs to be fixed. That's the answer I can give.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure how to respond to this question. I mean, one matter that we should definitely consider is what Tim mentioned earlier about food security. I mean, wherever there is a crisis, and, where is a conflict, and, we cannot transfer food on board vessels because there's another crisis at sea, then this further complicates things. And obviously, we have the problem of as I mentioned, migrants and refugees. I mean, the more crises of this type that we're having around Europe, the stricter European states become in terms of how they handle the people coming from Africa. So I have different things in mind, but I'm not sure 100% how to respond to the question.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, and I think we also shouldn't forget the people affected within Yemen itself. Also, you know, the current situation is negatively affecting them. I think there's many millions of people located within Houthi areas, and this certainly won't make things easier for them as well. So Phoebe, perhaps we could. I think maybe we've got time for one or two more questions, if there's any more in the chat.
Yeah, I think leading back to what Tim had to say during his final point, some of the audience members are wondering about, yeah, maybe if you could go a bit more deeper into some African countries' involvement in the conflict and whether we think we will see their increased involvement in the area in the Red Sea.
If I perhaps have a go at that, then the capabilities of most countries is not anywhere to the extent where navies from around the world can patrol as they've done for coming up 20 years in Somalia. Presence at sea is sometimes very difficult to sustain. From my perspective and the work we've been doing, the potential for combined maritime forces, I think there are certain questions, I think, from perspective looking from the African continent outwards, where looking at the shade mechanism for piracy, looking at the CMF, very few African countries perhaps involved, or if not from their willingness to be involved, their facilitation. I think we have to appreciate that the capabilities of most countries is very limited, and will be very coastal focused, if that as well. So African navies will be looking to play a role, and I think actually this is an opportunity just to mention as well that some of the concerns or controversies and around the Horn of Africa security at the moment relate around the future of Ethiopia's access to the sea and a potential naval role for a country, and that actually raises the interesting point of that even landlocked, or sometimes we call them land-linked countries, have a role as well to play as well. And this is where the channeling into existing mechanisms such as the Djibouti Code of Conduct or the African Union's maritime strategy becomes essential. But I think in terms of the because I think Martin, Rob, Sophia, have spelled this out in their writings beforehand, but also today, because of the legal questions around justification and mandates, that because it then becomes seen as such a political act to be present and patrolling, that this then becomes that matter for either EU, AU correspondence, or but also African mechanisms. Without wanting to dominate too much the answer as well, I hand over to everybody else. Thank you.
Rob or Sophia, do you have anything to add? Yeah, please.
Yes, I'd just add to what Tim said. I think that, whilst a lot of the littoral African states don't have especially large navies at the moment, because navies are expensive, the capabilities, but clearly African states have an interest in this region. This is their beach, and clearly big powers have an interest in this region, particularly given the status of the Red Sea and the canal and the Straits of Hormuz and the trade that comes out into the Gulf of Aden and this area. And already, there's a French naval base in Djibouti. There's a Chinese naval base in Djibouti. The US are in Djibouti. We've got Ethiopia looking to get a port in Eritrea. We've got Turkey playing a much bigger role here now as well. Somaliland, Somalia. The littoral states in this region are clearly deeply enmeshed in maritime security here. So, the fact that there are these other extra regional actors in there, I think it's just the way it's going to be, given how sensitive and how vital those particular sea lanes in this area are.
Sophia, would you like to add?
Yeah, just to add very briefly that we should not overlook the importance that the Suez Canal has for Egypt in terms of income. Egypt is very keen to make sure that the ships will continue traveling through the Suez Canal. And it's no coincidence that, you know, the EU, the Greek Prime Minister were there a few days ago signing an agreement in order to promote cooperation between Egypt and the EU and Greece. They want to make sure that Egypt is stable, that Egypt does not have a financial crisis, there will be no migrants, there will be no terrorist groups, you know, operating in the country because of a potential financial crisis. So the African states definitely have an interest in the matter. The question is whether they're able and what kind of support they need in order to respond to this crisis. And again, drawing on the experience that we have from Somalia, we need to make sure that the African states are able to respond on their own. You know, we cannot, it's not easy to keep sending warships in the region. It's very expensive. It's a very political issue. So we know it's important for us to make sure that the African states are able to respond and handle the situation on their own as well.
Perfect. And I think that's also a very very important point to keep in mind as we look to the future. And I think looking at the clock, I think that's we've run out of time for any more questions. So thank you, Phoebe, for monitoring the chat, and thank you to all of our participants for the excellent questions. So Rob, Sophia, Tim, and Martin, I would like to thank you all for joining us. I think it's been a really diverse and really interesting discussion. I hope that our participants have learned something. I definitely have. So indeed, I would like to thank everyone for joining us and for the great questions. I would like to also thank my colleague Phoebe and Aimi for helping to prepare this HILAC lecture. They've been really helpful, as well as Ada from the events department for helping with the tech points today. So please sign up to our Asser Institute newsletter and follow our social media channels if you want to see any of our future events. And for those of you based nearby in the Netherlands, you can still sign up for our 2024 annual lecture, which will be provided by Professor Fleur Johns, and that will be in the Peace Palace here in The Hague. And the topic of that lecture is Connection in a Divided World, Rethinking Community in International Law. So until next time, thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.